From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Cheung, and this matters. There is a long-standing problem of gender-based violence in Canada, where a woman or a girl is killed every 2.5 days, according to the Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability. Around the world, rates of domestic violence are climbing, as victims often have nowhere to go with stay-at-home orders in place. Canadian Minister for Women and Gender Equality, Maryam Monsef, calls it a powder keg. It's an uncomfortable truth, but there are two pandemics happening right now. There's the obvious one that's keeping millions of us inside. The shadow pandemic, though, as the United Nations calls it, is getting worse because inside isn't safe for people trapped with their abusers. What are the ways we can stop gender-based violence? And if public health is at the forefront of what we're talking about these days, isn't domestic violence one of the most urgent issues on that list? Toronto Star reporters Wendy Gillis and Alyshah Hasham are looking into this very question. Wendy is the Star's crime reporter, and Alyshah covers the courts and justice system. They're reporting on the idea of women's police stations, a safe haven where potential victims can get legal support and a place where there's trust in the system. And this idea isn't as radical as you might think. Wendy, Alyshah, thank you so much for making time for us.
Happy to be here.
So in the middle of a pandemic, it's inescapable that domestic violence and gender-based violence is really front and center. Abuse rates are rising in this country. Just last week, Canada has now its first incel terrorism charge after a homicide in North York. Wendy, you reported on that. Has anything changed in terms of the kinds of support coming from the federal government or from provincial governments?
I think what we have to be sort of careful of right now is just that we don't understand the full scope of what has happened during the pandemic. I don't think you will find anyone who would contest that the factors that lead to violence against women and intimate partner violence are now exacerbated. So, being closed up with your abuser, having fewer places to go. So how that has manifested has been different. And it's been kind of hard to track across the country. In some places, we're seeing police services and women's shelter workers report that they are seeing an increase in demand. Some places are saying there's an increase in kind of the types of incidents. They're more severe, which is obviously really troubling. And then in other places, we're seeing that there is actually a decrease in reporting to police or decrease in calls for service relating to violence against women. So it's been difficult to even kind of get a handle on how this pandemic has impacted violence against women. But like I said, I don't think that you will find anyone that will dispute that this is a problem that really has arisen during this time. So I think kind of at the outset, we saw the federal government make a commitment to, it was about $50 million to give to women's shelters. We saw $2.7 million given by the province at the outset of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. Obviously, that's a fantastic amount of money, but it won't take long before that runs out, especially given that many shelters and services for women who are facing violence were already really strapped for cash for a number of reasons.
Is there some mixed messaging on what's closed and what's open right now, too? I mean, not every shelter can stay open, but given that shelters are an essential service, is there some mixed messaging around that as well?
Certainly. I think that there has been some lack of clarity around what's open, what's closed. Even when I was doing some reporting on this early on, I was surprised to learn that police stations themselves are closed to the public, but they actually are open under certain circumstances, including for anyone who's facing violence who, needs help immediately. A major problem, too, has just been that if you are trapped at home with your abuser, you can't necessarily go into another room and make a call and feel safe about it, or even, do searches online or send someone a text without feeling that there might be a likelihood that your abuser could find out. So it's so much harder for victims to be able to communicate that they need help or that they're facing some danger when they can't go to work, when they're not getting breaks from their abuser, and when they're just stuck at home.
Alyshah, do you think that's why getting a good handle on how big of a problem this is and those probably underreported numbers. Is that why, of just that there's way less of a separation between victims and their abusers right now?
It could certainly be part of it. Like Wendy said, this exacerbates a lot of the problems that we have around reporting violence. Many of those things existed before. It also makes this sort of risk calculus that women do when it comes to reporting violence. It just makes it that much more difficult. There's lots of structural problems that we've reported on that existed prior to the pandemic around the lack of affordable housing, the lack of economic stability, fear around losing custody of children. All of those things are still things that exist, if not are more pressing right now. And so, if one partner has lost their job or things like that, those things are even more pressing right now and can exacerbate these things. But we may not see that result in more reporting because it just makes all of those reasons that people don't report so much more pressing, and it's a more difficult decision to make.
As far as solutions go, you've both written in The Star about possible ideas to fight gender-based violence. And one of those ideas is women's police stations. What exactly is that, and where does the idea come from?
Yeah, it dates back to kind of the mid-1980s when it's believed that the first women's police station was founded in Brazil. And since that time, the concept has been adopted and, changed, and variations have been made of it in various countries throughout Central and South America and in Africa. But I would say that the common theme is always preventing violence against women by men. So more recently, there has been a Canadian researcher who's sort of picked up on this idea and partnered with another violence against women expert in Australia. And they've started studying the possible utility of women's police stations in Canada and in Australia. And Alyshah and I saw a report come out a couple of weeks ago on the concept of women's police stations and how they've been working in Argentina, and thought it might be just an opportunity to look at this idea and think about some of the potential benefits.
So how differently would a police station for women look like? How is it staffed? How would it be different from how we understand police stations working now?
Right. I would say a few of the big differences are your standard police station is generally intended to take in offenders or perpetrators of crime. There's holding cells, whereas a women's police station kind of comes at the problem from a different way and is set up more so to serve the victims. So it doesn't have the holding cells. It has all kinds of services that would benefit someone who's facing violence. The differences can be very evident from the outset. In some places, these stations are kind of bright and painted and supposed to be very welcoming. They may have services that provide for childcare so that someone can come in and seek some help while they have kids in tow. And then really importantly, they're not necessarily established for the sole purpose of laying a charge against someone or introducing a victim into the criminal justice system. So that would mean that maybe someone does need a charge laid against someone or does need to get the police formally involved, or maybe they need to be set up with a social worker or a lawyer. Maybe they need someone to help them get some stable housing. So I think that it's a fundamental change in how you deal with a problem. Oftentimes, police stations are the tool that they use as a hammer, right? It doesn't discriminate really, whereas sometimes you need a scalpel or a surgical tool to really get at what the problem is. Another major difference would be that some of the problems that we've seen in the traditional model in policing come from, I don't want to paint every police officer with one brush, and certainly the researchers don't want to do that either, but we have seen major problems systemically in how policing deals with violence against women and sexual assault. And it doesn't take long to find examples of that in Canada, whether it's the unfounded rates that were dug up by Robin Doolittle of the Globe, or how big of a tragedy we saw in British Columbia with the killings of missing and murdered Indigenous women, which of course is a problem across Canada, but just having to do with the Picton homicides. So we know that policing doesn't always address the needs of, and unfortunately sometimes often doesn't address the needs of women who are facing violence.
Yeah, it's a system that historically has been pretty tough on victims.
Or doesn't necessarily, meet the needs of victims or take them seriously, meet them with sufficient empathy, treat them as kind of part of a larger problem as opposed to one single problem. Another thing that these stations would have would be officers who are trained to really handle these kinds of incidents and understand that usually violence is part of a larger pattern, and understand that often there's other solutions that can really help prevent and mitigate violence.
You mentioned that it's already been happening in Brazil, women's police stations, that they have been implemented in Brazil for decades now. What do the numbers look like there?
One thing that we know is that this kind of model hasn't been really sufficiently researched. That's why it's really exciting that this is getting some attention and some kind of academic rigor brought to it. One major challenge has been kind of lack of data and really getting a handle on how many women are killed, how many are killed by intimate partners, helpful data that really can help isolate the difference between places that have women's police stations and places that don't. What we do know is that in Argentina, in the province Buenos Aires, that's what these researchers studied, the area that they studied, the women's police stations represent about 1 in 5 of all police stations there. And what they were able to determine is that that province has one of the lowest rates of femicide in Latin America. Pretty big deal. And then in Brazil, where there also are women's police stations, where they have existed, the female femicide rate has dropped nearly 20% in recent years. But another really important thing to remember about defining success or trying to understand how effective these stations are is knowing that one of the major goals is prevention, obviously. And it's so hard to measure what doesn't happen, right? But I do think that for me, one of the most interesting aspects of this is having a really clear mandate to prevent these kinds of things from happening. And whether that is working one-on-one with family or even sometimes perpetrators. I mean, it's not as common, but sometimes the women's police stations are having the perpetrators, often typically men, coming in and saying, I need you to help me because I am violent. And there are services to help in that case too. Or whether it's sort of broader in terms of doing violence prevention work in a community, partnering with other associations, and really trying to change the conversation about violence against women.
Yeah, it sounds a lot more proactive rather than reactive after the fact and dealing with it through the offender.
Absolutely.
Alyshah, you cover the court system. How do you think that women's police stations can affect the back end of how these cases develop and how they work their way through the Canadian justice system?
Yeah, I think one of the goals of this model is to increase reporting, even though that's one of the good things about the model is that it's not entirely focused, as Wendy said, on laying charges, but rather sort of providing all the supports necessary or information necessary to even decide whether or not a woman wants to pursue the criminal justice route, which is something that we hear a lot about, where people feel they often don't have enough information about how the legal system works, about what the process will take, that it will take a long time, how the legal aid system works, what you're entitled to, what you're not entitled to, what the possible outcomes are. These are all conversations that it isn't easy to have right now. There's been things like an independent legal aid certificate that women can get to discuss their options prior to reporting sexual violence. And so this is the kind of thing that would build on something like that to allow women to know what their options are, know what things are going to look like in the future. And that could potentially make them better prepared to deal with the criminal justice system that historically has been really, really difficult and challenging for victims of domestic violence and victims of sexual violence. Even just from an information point of view, one of the things that I heard in interviews was that could be really helpful. But there are sort of other things about the model that may not work as well.
This is obviously a worldwide issue, but specifically here in Canada, there is an Indigenous perspective that you both reported on as well. I mean, femicide, gender-based violence, that's a huge part of our reckoning with the murdered and missing Indigenous women epidemic. What do Indigenous leaders, specifically women, what do they say about the idea of women's police stations?
There is some optimism around having a model that isn't entirely focused on police reporting, but some of the challenges arise around a couple of things. And one of them is that the idea of having a police-led model. Indigenous women have said many of these places that have these kinds of services, childcare, safe, supportive environments, culturally sensitive environments, these places already exist. They've been built by grassroots organizations. They've been built by women. They are already there. It may not be necessary to duplicate, may not even be possible to duplicate these kinds of places in a police-led environment. What they're saying is what might be better is to develop good relationships with police in their community, to have relationships of trust, to have police do the work that they need to do in terms of having specialized training and cultural sensitivity and all of those things, to be able to come into these places and potentially do things like take statements there, to be able to create a relationship with the community that would be more beneficial going forward, that could be linked to some of the community outreach work that it's a part of this model.
So working sort of within the systems that already exist rather than creating a brand new system that could, I guess, Bigfoot the support systems that are in place for Indigenous women.
Exactly. And that sort of ties into the other fear, which is a lack of resources. So we know that, as we discussed at the start of this, that violence against women and organizations that respond to that have been under-resourced, have been asking for more funding for a long time, and particularly in remote communities or rural communities where this kind of thing could be really helpful. It's unclear whether or not there would be enough investment to do this kind of thing right, which was a major concern, that we would sort of set up a pilot project and it might be good, but then it would never either be done widely enough to make a difference, or that it would be done in such a way that it wouldn't really be helpful. And there's also, rather than siloing this kind of thing off from the rest of the police, there was concern that all police need to have this kind of specialized training, that there needs to be a broad understanding of how to interact with victims of violence. And so the real focus for marginalized communities and vulnerable communities who have historically negative relationship with police, with other kinds of institutions, child welfare institutions, their interactions really need to be led by the community. And so for Indigenous women, it would have to be led by Indigenous women. And that's sort of really the message that we heard, that it's a really good idea, but it has to be done from a community-led perspective.
The point that you bring up is really interesting because obviously none of these issues are existing in a silo, like you're saying. And then, now we're very focused on the issue of public health with the pandemic and what life will look like after. I mean, we've heard some messaging from BC's Chief Medical Officer, Bonnie Henry, speaking directly to the issue of domestic violence.
Your immediate safety is more important than physical distancing or self-isolation. And that is important for people to recognize. There is help out there for you.
Obviously, domestic violence is the very definition of a public health issue. Could creating women's police stations actually be a natural part of how we change public health?
I think they're one option. I think we need to look at them far more closely to understand if they could actually make a big difference here in Canada or in certain parts of Canada. And so for that reason, I'm really happy that there's further research looking into this as one option. There are so many other ways that I think Canada needs to address this very big problem. I'm very happy that we are talking far more about this issue right now. It's unfortunate that it's taken a pandemic. It's unfortunate that it's taken, what is believed to be a rise in these kinds of incidents to really take it seriously. But it does present an opportunity to really start talking about how to revisit this, how to make some major changes, because it's so clear that there are some major problems and really big systemic issues that are contributing to this. One problem I frequently hear about is just a lack of affordable housing. There are women's shelters which provide emergency relief. But what happens when a victim needs to leave, when they want to restart their life and they don't really have a lot of options? That's a problem here in Toronto for sure, but it's present across Canada. And I think if we want to be serious about cutting down violence against women, we need to be talking about housing.
Alyshah?
I would just add that the other thing that the study touches on is that it's not necessarily only female victims who would be able to use the stations to report. There is discussion around having an inclusive reporting process regardless of gender identity. So to ensure that people who are, for example, non-binary would feel comfortable reporting as well. That's while historically the focus has been on women, sort of going forward, it would really need to be an inclusive space. But yeah, the good thing about looking into women's police stations is really the wraparound service component that covers so many different areas that domestic violence touches on, from housing to finances to therapy to legal advice. And it really pushes forward this understanding there's a lot of different structures and supports that need to be in place and that we need to work on as a society to improve if we are going to effectively respond to this.
Alyshah, Wendy, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
And that's Wendy Gillis and Alyshah Hasham from the Toronto Star. If you or someone you know are at risk, Wendy and Alyshah have put together a resource guide for how to get help at thestar.com/pleasehelp. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Cheung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Muthar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.